The newly elected MP for Rochdale, George Galloway, is routinely described as both effective and divisive in equal measure. But who is he really? Well, as for the basics, Galloway was born in 1954 in Dundee. In 1981, he became the youngest ever chair of Scottish Labour, and in 1983, he became General Secretary of the international anti-poverty charity War on Want. Galloway was first elected a Labour MP in 1987 to a seat in Glasgow, where he remained a Labour MP until 2003. In that time, he was a vigorous campaigner against sanctions on Iraq following the First Gulf War, and controversially, he met Saddam Hussein in 1994. Galloway went on to become vice chair of the Stop the War campaign from 2001, but it was the events following an interview he gave in Abu Dhabi that got him kicked out of the Labour Party. In that interview, he said this: "The wolves are Bush and Blair, not the soldiers. The soldiers are lions led by donkeys, sent to kill and be killed." That interview was controversial. He was called a traitor by many in the British press, and he responded like this: "As for being a traitor, the people who have betrayed this country are those who have sold it to a foreign power and who have been the miserable surrogates of a bigger power for reasons very few people in Britain can understand. Given that I believe this invasion is illegal, it follows that the only people fighting legally are the Iraqis who are defending their country. The best thing British troops can do is to refuse to obey illegal orders." Now, those statements seem entirely reasonable and were vindicated by history, but they were enough to get Galloway suspended from Labour for bringing the party into disrepute. That, however, did not stop him being an effective opponent of the Iraq War, and even his political foes admit he did so with unmatched eloquence, including in a 2005 hearing in the US Senate. Galloway here was defending himself against allegations that he profited from the Iraqi oil for food program.
"I've met Saddam Hussein exactly the same number of times as Donald Rumsfeld met him. The difference is Donald Rumsfeld met him to sell him guns and to give him maps, the better to target those guns. I met him to try and bring about an end to sanctions, suffering, and war, and on the second of the two occasions, I met him to try and persuade him to allow Dr. Hans Blix and the United Nations weapons inspectors back into the country.
And this was to be a...
I gave my heart and soul to stop you committing the disaster that you did commit in invading Iraq. And I told the world that your case for the war was a pack of lies."
Galloway's rhetorical flair was also used later that year against the essayist Christopher Hitchens.
"This war in which he glories, although how I wish he'd put on a tin hat and pick up a gun and go and fight himself. How I wish to see that sight. This war in which he glories has cost the lives, according to those well-known Saddamist fronts, the Lancet and Johns Hopkins University, well in excess of 100,000 people's lives, and hundreds of thousands more have been maimed and wounded. And it was all for a pack of lies. There were no weapons of mass destruction. There was no link between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. There was no link between Iraq and the atrocities on the 9th of September, on the 9/11 here in the United States. There was no welcome for the foreign armies that invaded Iraq. Hitchens said they would be greeted by flowers, but there are 2,000 young American boys lying in the ground now, testimony to the fact that they were welcomed by something else. And thousands more wounded, maimed, many of them in wheelchairs for the rest of their lives, testament to the folly of Hitchens and Bush and Cheney and the rest of the neocon gang that dragged your country into this disaster.
So Galloway's career as an orator wasn't damaged by being kicked out of Labour, and neither was his career as an MP to some degree. In 2005, he caused a huge upset by defeating the Blairite Una King in Bethnal Green and Bow. In that election, he stood for the newly formed Respect Party. And one of his first interviews on election night was with Jeremy Paxman.
Mr. Galloway, are you proud of having got rid of one of the very few black women in Parliament?
What a preposterous question. I know it's very late in the night, but wouldn't you be better by starting by congratulating me for one of the most sensational election results in modern history?
Are you proud of having got rid of one of the very few black women in Parliament?
I'm not, Jeremy, move on to your next question.
Well, you're not answering that one.
No, because I don't believe that people get elected because of the colour of their skin. I believe people get elected because of their record and because of their policies. So move on to your next question.
Are you
because
proud?
I've got a lot of people who want to speak to me.
If
you ask that question again, I'm going. I warn you now.
Don't try and threaten me, Mr. Galloway, please.
You're the one who's trying to badger me.
I'm not trying to badger you. I'm merely asking you whether you're proud of having driven out of Parliament one of the very few black women there, a woman you accused of having on her conscience the deaths of 100,000 people.
Oh, well, there's no doubt about that one.
If you haven't seen Brass Eye, I do recommend it. There is nothing more Chris Morris than when Jeremy Paxman said, "Are you threatening me, Mr. Galloway?" I mean, he's speaking to you by video call, so I mean, he can't really be threatening you like, "You want to fight?" Anyway, Galloway contested the 2010 general election in the neighbouring constituency of Poplar and Limehouse, but he was unsuccessful there. But in 2012, he returned to Parliament after winning a by-election in Bradford West. He lost that seat 3 years later after a very personal campaign against Labour's candidate, Naz Shah.
When a circus comes into town, it makes a lot of noise and it gets everybody's attention.
He's doing that now, though, isn't he?
Well, no, because if you see the Respect bus now, it goes round. Yesterday, it went past my office with 2 people on board.
Madrasa, you learning the Quran? Alhamdulillah.
It's not clear how things got so personal between Naz Shah and George Galloway, but it first came to a head at this hustings.
We have an absentee MP, and for me, the role of the MP in Bradford West is about being our voice in Parliament, but he's never there, as he's too busy earning loads elsewhere.
You claimed, and gullible journalists believed you, that you were subject to a forced marriage at the age of 15. But you were not 15. You were 16 and a half. I have your nikah. I have your nikah. Only...
What's my nikah got to do with Bradford West?
It didn't take long for the marriage certificate incident to spread on the internet, both sides accusing each other of lying. Police have confirmed they're investigating alleged smears on and offline.
I need to interrupt this profile with a correction. I said Brass Eye, it's the day today. Noel Doyle, thank you so much for correcting me. And I would have hated for you to have looked up Brass Eye and said, this is nothing like Jeremy Paxman interviewing George Galloway after the 2005 election. That personal campaign in Bradford West in 2015 wasn't effective for Galloway. He lost and only scored 21% of the vote. Naz Shah got 50%. So obviously the constituents there were more with her than him. And Galloway's electoral history is far from spotless. But with 3 election wins against Labour under his belt, it's not something to be dismissed. But does he deserve the support he periodically manages to command? Well, his critique of Labour's current policy in the Gaza war is valid, just as he was right about the Iraq war. But critics would argue that when it comes to human rights, George Galloway is far from consistent. Galloway worked for Russia Today until sanctions shut it down, and his commentary on the war in Ukraine has been fairly helpful for the Kremlin. In March 2022, he tweeted this: "It is now clear that the US is about to stage a false flag weapons of mass destruction incident in Ukraine. Fasten your seatbelts. #Russian Army." And false flags were a theme in this April broadcast of his talk show.
I don't believe that Bucha was a war crime. I believe it belongs in the long line of false flag operations used to trigger war from the Gulf of Tonkin in Vietnam in the 1960s, now absolutely revealed to have been a false flag operation, to
the attack on the American warship, the Vincennes, in the Mediterranean, to the false flag of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, to the false flag of the Gaddafi forces being given Viagra and sent out to rape people in eastern Libya. I've heard too many of these to believe them without evidence.
Now, we agree on this show. There have been enough false flags, or at least misreporting of people and armies and nations who are opposed to the United States in terms of foreign policy. So requiring evidence is fine. But Galloway said something there which also required evidence. He says he thinks this is a false flag. Now, the Bucha massacre, I mean, there is a lot of evidence that it actually happened, right? As we reported at the time. The evidence that it's a false flag is very weak. And if you're looking for an ulterior motive as to why he might be siding with the people who say it's a false flag, is because he was employed for a very long time by the Russian state, right? So he's not someone I would trust for neutral opinions on the war in Ukraine, and he was definitely putting forward a view there that Vladimir Putin would be very pleased with. Galloway is also controversial for these comments about the rape allegations against Julian Assange.
Even taken at its worst, if the allegations made by these two women were true, 100% true, and even if a camera in the room captured them, they don't constitute rape. At least not rape as anyone with any sense can possibly recognize it. And somebody has to say this. Let's take woman A. Woman A met Julian Assange, invited him back to her flat, gave him dinner, went to bed with him, had consensual sex with him, claims that she woke up to him having sex with her again. Something which can happen, you know. I mean, not everybody needs to be asked prior to each insertion. Some people believe that when you go to bed with somebody, take off your clothes and have sex with them and then fall asleep, you're already in the sex game with them.
Those comments were severely criticised by anti-rape campaigners, and they led to the resignation of then leader of the Respect Party, Salma Yaqub. She said this at the time: "I've always admired George's anti-imperialist stances, and I don't regret for a second standing side by side on those issues. But for me, to have to make a choice between that and standing up for the rights of women was a false choice. I thought it was blurring of something that didn't need to be blurred. It's not that complicated. You can hold two ideas at the same time." Salma Yaqub can hold two ideas at the same time, and George Galloway is capable of putting out more than one leaflet. In his latest campaign in Rochdale, some people got this one. So it says, "To the voters of the Muslim faith in Rochdale," and you've got, "I, George Galloway, have fought for Muslims at home and abroad all my life and paid a price for it. If Labour lose this by-election, Sir Keir Starmer could well be forced out as Labour leader. Sir Keir Starmer, a top supporter of Israel, out." And then he says, "With your support, I mean, if God wills it, I will give the 200 remaining days of this parliament to the service of all the people in Rochdale as your MP." So very much focused on Gaza there. Another letter he sent out. "First and foremost, I believe in Britain. That's why I fought for Brexit and why I fought against Scottish independence. I believe in family. I am a father of 6 children, 5 of them still at school, and I don't like some of the things they are teaching our children. I believe in men and women. God created everything in pairs. Unlike the mainstream parties, I have no difficulty in defining what a woman is." He goes on to say, "A man cannot become a woman just by declaring as such." And he says, "I believe in law and order. There will be no grooming gangs on my watch, even if I have to arrest them." And then he ends, then talks about the local economy, fair enough. And then he ends by saying, "Make Rochdale great again." One leaflet there very much speaking to, I suppose you could call them anti-woke talking points. Aaron, given a little profile there of George Galloway, undeniably a great orator. He's had undeniably some correct positions when it comes to foreign policy, also some ones which are more dubious and where it's quite easy, I think, to sort of impute cynical motives towards him. This sort of social conservatism that he sort of seems to have had fairly consistently, actually, throughout his career. How would you judge the guy?
Well, I think that's the first point, that on foreign policy, on anti-imperialism, on Palestine, etc., that stuff, that's documented back to the 80s. And on the social conservatism stuff, you're right as well. You can disagree with it, but the idea of a grifter is somebody who says things they don't believe. So these are two things that he fundamentally believes. That's somewhat distinct to the Assange and Naz Shah stuff, because for me, it's quite extraordinary, really, to watch somebody with Hitchens speaking to US legislators who is in a class of their own when it comes to rhetoric, but then in a by-election disputing whether somebody was 15 or 16 and a half when they got married. I mean, legally that matters, but it just, there's a grating there, and it sort of shows, I think, what could have been. He is a tremendously talented orator. I think if his ego had been kept in check, I think if we had proportional representation in this country with the possibility of a larger left-wing party, he could have been a very successful political figure. In a way, not dissimilar to Farage, although I should say he's been an MP since 1987. Nigel Farage has never been an MP. Who gets more attention in the media? Reform. They've had all this coverage in the media, all these millions of pounds spent. They've never won a parliamentary seat. George Galloway just did it. So, I think for me, it boils down to this, which is on Iraq, he was 100% correct on the single biggest error of British foreign policy, and I include the Suez Crisis, since the Second World War, easily. And he was almost not a lone voice, because, of course, there were many dissenters in the Labour Party, including Jeremy Corbyn, Robin Cook. But I think to be so overtly, charismatically against something, he was pretty unique. I think that brought him lots of goodwill, and I think that should never be forgotten. It should never be forgotten, and it won't be forgotten. But this other stuff matters too, of course. The Assange comments, the Naz Shah comments, just bizarre in a way. But going to Rochdale, I don't really see much of a problem with quote-unquote micro-targeting. So forget what was in those two leaflets for one moment. Michael, every single party does this, right? Every single party. And all the pundits and the politicians saying otherwise on TV over the last 24 hours, 48 hours, either don't know what they're talking about, and you shouldn't be listening to them because they're not, informed, or they're lying to you. We saw in 2019, for instance, in Harrow, the Conservative Party micro-targeted British Indians in regards to a foreign policy issue, Labour's purported position on Kashmir. They did that with that particular subgroup of voters. So the idea that, this was invented by George Galloway, it's sectarian, it's divisive, well, you can think all of those things. I don't. Park that for a moment. But it's not new. And all the parties do it. Every single party will talk about certain wards, certain streets as these are our voters because of X, Y, Z characteristics. Isn't it funny? In 2008, 2012, Barack Obama wins with predictive modeling, with these voter profiles, which were done in a whole new way, which allowed for micro-targeting, digital messages, offline messages, strategic messaging. What are you talking about? Where, when, why? Everybody said, how clever. This has changed politics forever. When the Leave vote did something similar in 2016, because it was the other side, the exact same people who praised Obama were calling it evil. And now, of course, Galloway is doing something similar, although in a far less, technologically sophisticated way. We're hearing similar things. So that's not new. It's very common. In terms of the content of the two letters, well, he's clearly not going to get rid of Keir Starmer, but I think everything he's saying in regards to Gaza, that he'll be a voice for Gaza over the next 200 days or whatever it may be, that's accurate, that's correct. The things he said in the other leaflet, he does believe them. I disagree with many of the things he said, but he does believe those things. And the truth is, there will be many voters who are allured by, not many voters, there'll be a significant number of voters who agree with both of those leaflets. So the idea that they will agree with one, but they're being misled because there's this completely other, different candidate who's saying something different, I don't really buy. If you had a leaflet that was saying, I will defend Gaza, and then to other households, I will stand by Israel, then I get what you're talking about. But this is somewhat different. George Galloway has never sold himself as a social liberal. And if he did, by the way, I'd agree with him on a lot more stuff. I do agree with him on the foreign policy stuff. And again, it goes back to sophistication within the electorate, Michael. Many people will have voted for Galloway yesterday, and in Bradford West, and in Burn Bethnal Green. They're not stupid. They'll say, well, I disagree with him on X, Y, Z issues, but on this one thing, which basically nobody else in British politics is talking about, I agree with him a lot. So yeah, put him in Parliament. And also, this really does undo the claim that he didn't really care about the local economy. You know, very politically astute to talk about Rochdale Football Club and how he would save the football club. It's a big part of the civic fabric of that town, as football clubs invariably are, especially in smaller towns. Places like Oldham, Rochdale, Bury. Of course, Bury lost their club a few years ago. I think it's back now. They're a big part of the social and political fabric of these places, and you know he used that. And I'll finish with this. What was the offer from Labour? Was Labour going to institute a 4-day week and, you know, have universal childcare and guaranteed social income and rent caps? No. So if you think that, well, on all these issues, they'll broadly be the same, but I care about Rochdale Football Club. I care about actually Rochdale just being in the national spotlight for a few weeks or months, and I care about Gaza, I'll vote for Galloway. It doesn't mean you agree with absolutely everything he's saying. You know, and an adult knows that you talk to the electorate when you canvass. They will say that. Well, I don't agree with him on everything, but he's quite good, or she's quite good, or I actually agree with her on many things, but on this she's bad, so I'm not going to vote. It's a deal breaker for me. You know, that level of sophistication is out there, it exists, but it's very rarely acknowledged within political coverage in the media.